writing for games is it contains like plenty of kind of unique challenges compared to writing for other media, notably in that it has to fit the game itself, and games are characterized by their interactivity, right? That's their defining principle, is that you can, you typically play as a character or multiple characters even, and can influence the world through your actions. So just writing to serve the game structure and the design means that my writing is kind of I can only write for as much design of the game as actually exists. I may have the idea for a bigger story from the beginning of the project, and indeed it's really important to me to outline the story early on so that I and my colleagues have a general sense of where it's going. But the kind of the writing process itself takes place throughout the entire duration of development, which for Hades was about 3 years. Because we're constantly evolving the game, and if you've played Hades, you know that the kind of the character dialogue, the story situations can be highly specific to the kinds of things that are happening and the circumstances that the player finds themselves in. So, until we know exactly what those circumstances are through the game design process, we can't write all those scenes. So I would describe the writing process as kind of highly adaptive to the design. I participate in the design process itself. So we're constantly kind of pushing the design of the game forward, coming up with new, either new features or just expansions to the content that's there. And then I'm always thinking about how the writing can support that and help make our extensions to the game feel like they're part of the world. Developing Hades in early access was one of the first decisions that we made on the project. Like we wanted to, whatever the game was going to be, we were really interested in that process of putting something out there that was a representative of what the full experience would be, but would be an incomplete version of it, and then developing the rest of it, getting feedback from our community. We've seen a number of games develop that way very successfully, and we wondered if we could do it when we anticipated doing it from the beginning. And one of the big questions that we had was, can this type of development process work with a game that has a large narrative component? Because typically early access development is reserved for games that are kind of very, I would say, systems heavy. They're very kind of replayable. They don't have a lot of story to them. But in our case, we were interested in telling this kind of continuous story through the game structure of Hades, where you're constantly starting over from the beginning, but the story keeps moving forward like one continuous story. So early access worked out extremely well from a story standpoint. It had a number of really big benefits. Our previous games, Pyre and Transistor, for example, they took about 3 years to make. I'm working on the story most of that time, and then we find out how we did once it's done, and we get all the feedback once it's over. So we asked ourselves, what if we could get some of that feedback while we could still do something about it? Instead of when you're already done. And that's kind of what leads to the decision to go early access. And it worked out just that way. One of the great things that happened was that we saw that players connected with our cast of characters early on. So we saw a lot of kind of positive feedback about the tone of the game, Zagreus' character, our protagonist, and a lot of the supporting cast. And that was great because as creators, we, however confident our work may seem, a lot of the development process is not particularly confident, at least not for us. We often wonder whether our work is good enough. And when your audience tells you, this is good, I love these characters, I'd like to see more of these characters, fantastic. We can focus on that. No, it's not, because the story is for the people who experience it. That will be some amount of people, and it's for them. And we fill our games as much as possible with these highly specific moments that are designed to be easily missable. They're supposed to be highly specific, so that when you encounter them, they feel kind of magical. You have the realization that, like, wow, this is so strange that this game paid attention to this, like, very kind of specific set of circumstances, and I wonder, does this happen to everyone? It can't possibly happen to everyone. And then you feel special because you know it happened to you. So, you know, it's for that player. Some player's going to see it. And we would get you know, during early access we would get some data from how players were experiencing the game, and I would get access to a report of which story events would be seen the least. You know, and a whole bunch of them would have, like, you know, 1% of players, less than 1% of players, or even sometimes they would have 0% of players, which usually indicated there was a bug, which was very useful, like it wasn't set up correctly or it wasn't working correctly. But there are tons and tons of events that very, very few people see. But the thing is, if there's enough of them, then, you know, almost all players will see one of them or a couple of them or something like that, even though not everyone will see them all. So I think it's just the nature, you know, I don't think that ultimately it's that different from writing for other media, because if you write a 600-page novel, you can't expect, probably not everybody is going to get to the end of it. But you try to make the ending worthwhile for everyone who is going to get there. I think that there's been great writing in games for decades, since the 80s. In the 80s, there was a genre called the text adventure game, which consisted of nothing besides the text itself. Just, you know, text on a computer screen, and then you would input commands to kind of influence the story, saying where the character goes or what the character interacts with. Those games were only as good as their writing and their story, and there were some classics among them that I remember fondly to this day. But, you know, writing in games is not fundamentally necessary. That's the difference between games and say, novels. You can't have a novel without the writing, but you can have a game. You can have a game without the writing. Take, like, Tetris, for example. It's, you know, or Super Mario Brothers. They're these classic games. But the writing is, you know, is not really a component of them. But I think more and more over time, more games have kind of increasingly put a significant value on writing and characters, just with coming from the same understanding that we have at Supergiant, which is that it can just enhance the rest of the experience. When it feels like it's an integral part of the game, and when it's executed in such a way that it's not kind of obtrusive to the game experience. Because with a game, you are there to play. You're not there to read. You're not there to watch. You're there to interact. But other than that, the form of games is so open-ended that writing in it can take many different forms, and it can enhance a game in many different ways. And I see games doing great things with writing all the time. It was a very important part of Hades to us that we kind of do something interesting with the moment of failure. The genre, the video game genre of that Hades belongs to is called the Roguelike, which are games that are structured around dying and restarting, and each time you restart, you kind of lose everything, but the whole world is different. So there are games that are compelling because they're different each time you play, and that makes them, kind of highly replayable. Even though you could play them for, a few minutes at a time, you could also find them engaging to play over and over again. But roguelike games face sort of an ironic challenge, which is that they're often very difficult so that they can kill you off so that you can start over and experience what's new and interesting about them. However, dying in such games, as a result, can be very frustrating and cause you to want to stop playing. And if you stop playing, then you're not experiencing what's unique and interesting about a roguelike game, which is that it's different every time. So we really, when we set out to make a game in this genre, we really focused on that moment of failure and trying to make it as non-frustrating and as interesting and compelling as possible. And the role of the narrative is partly there as a tool in service of that goal. We're like, well, first of all, we love this idea of the structure where you're starting over each time. But as a player, even though you lose all your fancy equipment and things like that, you still carry forward your knowledge of the game. So we wanted to have a narrative premise that kind of aligned with the player's own perspective, and have a character that essentially remembers everything that happened from one death to another. And then the other part is to kind of take the sting out of failure. Well, even though you lost, just that's part of the story, that's part of the game. Don't feel bad about it. That's part of life, even as a theme. This is how you learn. This is how you improve. So we just wanted to lean into that as much as possible, and we were interested in using this sort of genre structure to tell a story. But then, more specifically, having more of the story unfold after you die was there to help kind of ease the suffering of losing that can make someone want to stop playing a game like that. So it's about defining the kind of critical path of the story, which has to be very concise, I guess, for a game like this. Just has to be key events that logically flow from one to the next, and nothing inessential. But for the player who goes, at a more reasonable pace, they're going to see a lot of the kind of optional stuff along each stage of that story. So we basically had to manage it that way. And that's another area where the early access feedback could really help, where players could be like, hey, I'm at this point in the story, but I got this event, this didn't really make sense here. Oh, great. We can fix that. We can make sure that event, doesn't play or plays earlier, that sort of thing. So there's a lot of, the game has thousands of unique little events in it. So we had to kind of make sure that they all were sequenced in a logical way. The game is actually picking them at random, but it's picking them at random while accounting for the kind of context. It only chooses from ones that are contextually appropriate. So so that makes it so that no two players are going to experience the story in the same way, but hopefully it still feels whatever story you're getting is still highly contextual to where you are, and it still feels like it's kind of logically flowing. In a lot of video games, you can get to the moment where characters start to repeat their dialogue or have nothing left to say anymore. And even in very well-written games, those moments can be kind of disappointing. They're kind of, they break your immersion a little bit. You're like, oh, okay, this character has nothing left to say. It's not particularly lifelike. So in Hades, we really wanted to avoid that by just having a lot of stuff for characters to say, including a lot of these kind of shorter, more I guess, generic lines. But there's so many of those that by the time any of those repeat, it's been, 20 hours or something like that. So that hopefully you won't even notice that those are repeating, and that can carry players, into very late into the game. And we see players who are saying, I've played for 100 hours and I'm still seeing new stuff. That wasn't necessarily, there wasn't a goal around how much time it would take to get through the story. We just wanted the story to not fall off for players as long as they were interested in the game. And knowing that people may play the game for many hours, we just wanted the story to just kind of hold up for them, and not to have that moment where the characters just, suddenly feel like cardboard or something like that. Our discovery of Zagreus inspired the entire story. We were already interested in creating a roguelike game in a Greek myth theme, because we love the idea that of the kind of the fickle gods, that sometimes they're on your side and sometimes they're against you, and being blessed by the gods in different ways, that type of thing. But as we were, I've been fascinated by Greek myth since I was a little kid, but I had never heard of Zagreus before working on Hades, and I was researching the underworld in particular, and came upon the name and the idea that Hades may have had a son, according to Aeschylus at least. There's like a small scrap of a play that suggests that Zagreus is the son of Hades, and it's like, wait a minute, Hades is one of the best known Greek gods, but it's really not known that he has a child. So that was so compelling to us that we wanted to build a whole story around it, and we loved the idea that, like, part of we wanted to explore why no one knows about him, and sort of figure out how he may fit into the better known myths about Hades. And the part where he's a relatively unknown is honestly a really big advantage when working on a story, because compare him to say Zeus or Athena or Heracles, these kind of really big names from Greek myth, where many stories have already been told about them. Many expectations exist about how they are, who they are. It's easier to work with kind of a blank slate, because you just have fewer expectations to just kind of, you just have fewer constraints on your story, basically. Because if you're writing a story about Heracles, you either have to say all the stuff you know about him is true, or all the stuff you know about him isn't true, or some combination of the two. But you have to rely on, lean heavily on existing information. Whereas with Zagreus, there's so little to draw upon that it meant that he could just sort of fit the world. And we wanted to tell a story from the point of view of the underworld itself. What's the culture like down there? What's it like having Hades as your father? He's the first speaking protagonist that we've ever had in one of our games. So it was a big challenge for us to have this character. One of the challenges in games is that since you're playing it, if the character you're playing has different opinions and beliefs than you as a player, it can be really kind of dissonant. It's no fun when the character is like making stupid decisions or acting like a jerk or something like that. So we had to figure out what personality this character had. But it all tied back to the roguelike structure, actually, where you're constantly dying and failing and starting over. And we like the idea of a character who's just not, he's going to be determined, and he's not going to take himself too seriously, because he's in kind of a ridiculous situation, and he's just going to, he's going to laugh at himself more than he's going to get really, dark and brooding. It was really fun to explore how, like I said, how he might fit into the mythology, how he might connect some of the, because Greek myth is filled with so much contradiction, and despite how much of it exists, there's so many gaps in it also. So many stories don't necessarily make sense. So we thought, how could they make sense? How could they be connected? And Zagreus was the key to that. So we had to ask ourselves when we were starting to work on this game, what business do we have trying to adapt Greek myth? It's one of the most kind of widely adapted subject matters out there. There are many great works that have adapted Greek myth in exciting and interesting ways, and then there are many works that have done things that are kind of more familiar with it. So we had to ask ourselves, do we have a point of view on this that is interesting enough, at least to us, to be worth exploring and to put out there? And we, for me personally, I feel as though many adaptations of Greek myth are not necessarily drawing from the classics. It almost feels like they're drawing from other modern adaptations of Greek myth, like the portrayal of Zeus, as kind of a benevolent patriarch. He's almost been conflated with like biblical God in a lot of adaptations, and it's very odd to me, because if you're familiar with classical Greek myth, Zeus is not he's not what you would say a nice guy. So we were very interested in the humanity of the gods, and our kind of hypothesis was that what makes the Greek gods interesting, the reason we're still talking about them after thousands of years, is their humanity. Is that they remind us of our best selves and also our worst selves. And we really wanted to play into this kind of big dysfunctional family that's constantly bickering and has these kind of ridiculous characters in it, because they do outlandish things in classical myth, and they do incredibly dark things, but they do ridiculous things as well. And knowing that we wanted to tell a family story, it was important to us to find the tone that was appropriate. So we decided that we did not want to go into the depths of the darkness of Greek myth in this game, because if you go there, that has to be what the story is about, because it is some of the most kind of horrific stuff you'll ever read. But there are also other parts of Greek myth that are about the family dynamics, that are about love and friendship, and positive things, not just like horrible negative things. And so we chose to focus on those things because we were interested in telling a story about family, through the underworld using these characters. It was specifically the image of, so there's Cerberus, the three-headed hound of hell that's the guardian of the underworld. Cerberus is the pet of Hades, the god of the dead. So like recognizing that this terrible, horrifying dog is just the pet of one of these gods, like it made us laugh, and it was like that was the image that kind of crystallized the tone that we wanted. The idea that there's this kind of grim, cruel father with his terrifying pet, and he's calling his son a fool. His son is saying, "I hate you, Dad. I want to get out of here." And it's like those kind of family stories have existed through the ages. So we did want to tell a story that people could feel kind of a human connection to, because that's as writers, I think we all, hopefully we know by now that personal stakes matter, can be much more impactful than so-called like grand stakes. Like, who cares about the end of the world? Like, I've never had to save the world. I don't know what that's like, but I know what it's like having a father who's upset with me about something, and having to kind of navigate that situation. So we're just always interested in the kind of our characters and their human, taking a fantastical set of circumstances, but having kind of very human stories within them. That's kind of what we've always tried to do, I think.